This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
I'm glad you're still studying with us in the book of Genesis. We are now beginning in chapter 18, the deliverance of Lot from Sodom. It's quite an interesting story that we have here, and I really shy from using the word story, but I did. To me, these are not just stories. When a person says a story, I think of something made up. But then again, it can sometimes mean not made up stories, but it still kind of holds that connotation with me, so I don't like using it too well. But we're talking about the account then, if you will, of Lot and his deliverance from Sodom, from this very wicked environment that he has been living in with his family. We'll notice in this particular session that he's going to greet these visitors that come in, and he greets them at the gate. That's not necessarily anything exceptional, but you stop and think of what this really implies. It is possible that these people recognize Lot for who he is and what he is and use him for a judge, because sitting in the gates means a judge of the city. Also, he knows this city well enough that he is willing to sit out there at the gate and greet strangers coming in and take them away from the environment to protect them from what is surrounding them. This is a good man that we're looking at. Lot is a very good man. In the first 8 verses then, we see the greeting of these 3 strangers. The greeting of Abram now, or Abraham. And the Lord appears to them. We spoke just briefly last time about the difference between a theophany and an anthropomorphism. And a theophany is where the physical body is used, where a body is used to house, in this case, deity, or to house an angel, where a body is actually used, as opposed to anthropomorphism, where you describe God as having an arm of power, just using the description of our arm giving power, or our eyes God sees, things like this. It's different than just calling names of parts of the body and attributing them to deity. But here we have an actual appearance of 3 men. You notice that Abraham says, "My Lord." In many of the texts that's capitalized. But then, do we really know that Abraham knew him as Jehovah at that time? That he knew him as God? I don't think so. It's possible, but I do not think he does at this point. He is just using very polite language that they would use at that time, and we're going to see it more as we get on here. He tells them that he wants them to wash their feet, to rest themselves. And Abraham says, "I want to serve you a meal." All of this is being very, very polite. In other words, strangers or people even who, especially people who would know him, know that they could come by and be treated well, be protected, and to receive the things they need to go on to the next place. Very, very polite people. In verses 9 through 15, we see that the son is promised, and we have Sarah in an unbelieving position at this time. She's the one that's going to be questioning this. I want you to notice, if you will, in verse 10, the omniscience now that we have of Jehovah, of this angel. Sarah is going to laugh, but where? In the tent door that is behind him. And he is going to know it. And he's going to ask them, why did Sarah laugh? And she's going to deny it. She's going to lie. Now, say it another way. She is going to tell a lie. But then she is rebuked, and nothing more is said of it. So the rebuke must have held for her. She then kept quiet. There's nothing else told on the situation. You notice in verse 20, "And the Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great," and he goes on, but the outcry against, this literally means for the sin held against these people. Sin is an outcry. It is going completely against God's will. So again, it's the sin, if it were personified, crying out to God. And God is going to have to handle it. God is going to have to take care of it. Then we have him telling Abraham of what is going to happen. Why tell Abraham at all? What need does Abraham have of this knowledge, especially in advance? What need is there at all? Well, first of all, we've learned in the Scriptures that Abraham is God's friend. He is his friend. And not only that, but then he will be able to tell his children, who will be able to tell their children, who will be able to tell their children, and this will be an example of what happens to unrighteous people. It'd be a very good thing to tell over and over and over to help impress it on the minds of your family, and especially the young, of why be righteous. Be righteous is the idea. And they'd be able to retell this at many times. Verses 23 to 33, we have, if you will, now Abraham pleading for these people. All of them? No, no. For the righteous. And of course he starts out with 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. Each time he keeps, and his language is so polite. Now, I have spoken before. He says, let me speak again. Or let me not be offensive. Don't let me hurt you, but let me ask again. He just keeps lowering the numbers. And finally comes down, if there are 10 righteous people. Think about that. 10 righteous in that. If there are just 10, he will let them go. Again, this is that lesson, remember, that we had about nations? When it comes to a time when there are not enough righteous people or enough righteousness within a nation, God will bring it to an end. We see it here on a smaller scale. We see it in these cities in the plain. God says it must come to an end. But if there were 10, he'd spare it. But there are not going to be 10 found in the town. Not 10 at all. And who is it that terminates the conversation? Jehovah does. It's over. For 10, it's settled. I will not go any lower. Well, Sodom is guilty and is now going to be destroyed, we see in chapter 19. We're also going to see the birth of Moab and Ammon in this chapter. Again, as I mentioned before, we see the righteousness of Lot now. These two men come into the town, and he is not going to leave them in the streets. He's going to extend hospitality to them. He's going to spare them, if he can, from the Sodomites around him, from those in this town. And of course, in English, we get the word sodomite, meaning one who practices this kind of filthy sin. This name just continues on with us, even in our language today. We see in verses 4 through 11 just how vicious these people are, just how terrible they are. In fact, this wickedness is from the whole city, from left to right, beforehand, behind, from all over. It's from the whole city. They are unrighteous. Now, when we talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, I want to look at really, were there just two cities? Well, if you remember, there were 5 altogether. If we go back into history a little bit here, well, there were actually 5, as I said. Who are these cities? Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboam, and Zoar. Now, these are the 5 kings, remember, that we had the battle with before, that are 4 to help then relieve Sodom and to relieve Lot from the situation. And we see these are destroyed, and they're named specifically in Deuteronomy 29 and 23. In Hosea 11 and 8, Admah and Zeboam are used for an illustration there as well. But the town of Zoar is spared. We see in 19 verses 21 and 22. And Zoar means little place, little town, and that it is its name. So actually there are 5 cities, 4 are going to be destroyed, but we just normally hear of Sodom and Gomorrah. We don't hear of Admah and Zeboam very often. It's hardly ever mentioned when people talk about it. Well, these men come and they're wanting to practice their wickedness on these 2 men. And of course Lot goes out, he closes the door behind him and says, "Don't let it be, brethren, don't let it be." He talks to these, he does not want to let it happen, so, and they begin to press on him. And he then offers his 2 daughters who have never known a man as substitutes. Why? We have to ask the question, why? We're not told why, my friend. So be very careful about assigning motives here. But we do know it is sin. We do know that that was sin. And so these men now are going to reach out and bring Lot back into the house and spare him from committing more sin. Doing a lesser sin, quote, if you will, as opposed to the greater sin out. I don't like greater and lesser, but he's got something in his mind that offers these 2 girls. We don't know why. The reasons are just simply not given to us. But the angels spare Lot and the daughters from further sin in this situation. In verses 12 to 14, they say, now go out into the city and warn all of the members of your family and get them out of town. Destruction is coming. Get out there, tell these people that are related to you, get them out of your town. You notice it says not those that are not under your roof. But what about these sons-in-laws? Why, they think he's mad. Here the man is going out there and he's telling them this place is going to be destroyed. Destruction is coming upon us. Come, get out of town. Be saved with us. How many times, my friend, when you're having a Bible with somebody and you show them they are lost and you are showing them a way out, how many times do those people think you're mad too? Or a little crazy? That you really think you have the answer for them? I'm afraid, my friends, that really hasn't changed much. You offer salvation, you tell them of the condemnation that's coming, they just kind of laugh at you, ridicule you. But we have to keep telling, because there are souls out there that will respond to the truth. But I'm afraid we're not much different today than these people were back here in Sodom and Gomorrah. So he warned, and they just thought he was mad. Now, we're not going to go with you. 15 through 22, we see the escape itself. He wants to go then off to Zoar, this tiny place. But do you notice that this angel then says, I cannot do anything until you arrive there. Now think about that. Jehovah has sent these 2 men down here to destroy all of this, but they cannot do it. They cannot touch that area until these righteous people are taken out. Does this say something about God taking care of His own? Does this say something about God working to keep His righteous well? Yes. Now be careful in your own personal life about over-applying providence. Each one of us can look back into our lives and say, oh, I can see God's providence working there and there and there. Can I honestly identify that specifically and say, thus it is, that was providence for this purpose? No, I can't. For you see, it isn't written down in here. If that particular instance in my life was written here, I could identify it, but it isn't. So be careful about over-applying providence. But we can look back and we know that God's providence has worked in our lives, and we are very sure in certain areas that it was there. But I definitely wouldn't want to be making the mistake of saying that was definitely God's providence working in a certain situation. Verses 23 through 25, then we see that fire and brimstone comes down on the entire area. That whole area in this valley is going to be affected, the entire thing. Well, I guess it had to come to this. One of those parties escaping has to have disobedience. And we're talking, of course, about Lot's wife. She is made a pillar of salt as a result. And what did Jesus say about this? He said, remember Lot's wife. Why? What's the message? The message is, do not hesitate. Always hold fast to God's way of escape. That's the point that's being made. Look, remember Lot's wife. She was offered a way out, but yet she did what? She violated God's ruling on the situation. And she lost her life for it. Can we say that this also might apply to us today? Oh, we're not going to be made pillars of salt. No, don't let me be heard saying that. But I want to read to you 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you except as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. But with the temptation will also make a way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. Now, a couple other passages to go along with this would be Hebrews chapter 4, verse 16, and 2 Peter 2, verse 9. They essentially say the same thing. In fact, the Hebrews one gives the idea of help coming, just it were in English, as we have that saying, by the skin of your teeth. In other words, just in the nick of time. Just exactly when you need to have the way of escape, it's going to be there, and God will provide it. But, my friends, He doesn't force us to take it, just as He did not force Lot's wife. He offers the way of escape to us. It's our responsibility then to look for the way of escape and get out. I think of Joseph later on, as we're going to be coming up in the latter chapters of this book. Think about him and about the temptation that came to him with Potiphar's wife. He looked around and there was nothing else to do but to run out of that room. Was that his way of escape? Yes. He's put in prison, but well, we'll talk about those things when we get there. It was God's providence, though, but there was a way of escape. There was for these people, there will be for you and me. We have that promise from God. We have the promise from God. There is a way out. God will have it there for you and me. And He did for these people. And the angel acknowledged it. I cannot do anything. I can do nothing until you're gone. Excuse me, gone and out of here. He needs to have these people move on so that He can do what He needs to do. Excuse me, please. Now, we see in verse 29 that Lot is spared for Abraham's sake. In James 5 and 16, we will learn that the prayers of a righteous man availeth or worketh much. I can understand Abraham praying for Lot and him being spared. Can you? I can, very definitely. But also in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 6 and 7, Lot himself is referred to as a righteous man. And so we have here two men, if you will, one praying for him, and this one then being concerned, but being a God-fearing man, and in this case, obeying him immediately. Well, he's seen the workings of God around him. He's seen it through Abraham. He's seen it before that. This man understands, and he is also a righteous person. We need to be careful, do we not, when we look back at some of the things that we might accuse him of and wonder about God's taking care of him. But you see, if he's a righteous man, he's looked at his life, he's confessed his sin, and he's come back to God. He is a righteous man. Well, we see incest coming up with these two daughters and Lot. It's sad. We see it in verses 30 through 38. The girls seem to have a good motive, a seed to our father. It seems that they have a good motive, but stop and think about where had they been living? They'd been living in Sodom. They had other sisters, remember? Lot went to the sons-in-laws and they thought he was mad. They had other sisters. They were destroyed in all of this. But are these two girls also affected a little bit by the surroundings that they came out of? I really kind of imagine that they were affected by that, aren't you? We need to be careful of the environments that we have our children in and help as much as we can with our grandchildren. But we need to help get them out of those environments. But if they go into those environments, oh, the strong strength you have to help them come through it. Oh, there are so many things pulling. And we can see it back here that there was so much of the city pulling on these girls. And you wonder, has it pulled upon them too hard? Are they giving in to just some of the ways? Well, moving on now, chapter 20. We're going to have Abraham and Abimelech. Incidentally, Abimelech is not a personal name. It means king, the king of the area, that particular king, Abimelech. What do we have? Well, we lied, did we not? Abraham, did he not lie to Pharaoh back in chapter 12? Are we going to find it coming up again? Yes, right here and now. And he's going to claim again that Sarah is his sister. But Abimelech has a dream. Restore Sarah. Uh-oh. Do not commit adultery with her. Do not take her. Now this brings up a question, right? I mean, I've heard recently, even over the last 20 years, I've heard people say, well, you know, you have to be in a covenant relationship with God in order to come up under the laws for adultery and things in the New Testament. That if you're not in a covenant relationship, then you're not responsible to the laws regarding marriage, divorce, and remarriage. So no matter how many times you've divorced and remarried, you can come to God and be right in this last marriage, even though it was adulterous before. It'll make it good. Baptism will make it good. No. I want you to know that these people were unrighteous if they committed adultery, and they were not in a right relationship with God, or that a covenant relationship, I should say. Abimelech was not in a covenant relationship with God, but yet he could commit adultery. And God says to him, don't do it. So it's a universal law. It covers everybody at all times. Well, Abraham is reproved again. He's got to learn his lesson. And incidentally, in these verses 8 through 13 is where we really learn that Sarah is his half-sister. This is where we learn that particular detail. So Abimelech, the king, gives gifts to Abraham and Sarah. And what does this mean? Well, the scripture tells us that means that they are reproved. The giving of the gifts reproved them, rebuked them, if you will, for what they had done. Well, God says, Abraham, you pray for these people. I will heal them if you will pray for them. And he does. And they are healed. We see now the birth and marriage of Isaac, the son of promise, in this next section, 21 to 24. The birth of Isaac and the expulsion of Ishmael here in 21, verses 1 through 21. Isaac, finally. Isaac is born just as it was promised. How old is Abraham at this time? He's 100 years old. 100 years old. Verses 6 through 8, we see the joy of Sarah. And Abraham gives a feast on the day that he is weaned. He's given a feast on the day that he is weaned. Well, here we come again. Verses 9 through 11. Polygamy is here. What's happened? Sin raises its ugly head one more time. Friction, problems, if not between the wives, between the children, and we see it here. We see it very clearly. So, God then speaks to Abraham, and he sanctions this time the expulsion of Ishmael. Why? Verse 12. Isaac is the promised seed. Plus the fact that God is going to look after Ishmael too. And remember, he's going to have a great line come from him. 12 princes. There's going to be a great line from him also. He is to be a great nation. We see that again in verse 13. So they're sent out. Pretty soon, no water. And God answers their grief. He hears them. And again now, the promise is given to Hagar about Ishmael. He is going to be a great nation. And water is there. Her eyes are opened and she sees it. water is given by them. And what happens? He grows up. And as you would expect with his mother being Egyptian, who does he marry? He marries Egyptian also. But we have this young man coming through this trial, growing up. And again, remember, he's going to be a wild man when he grows up. He's going to be living in the face of his relatives, as if you were, that constantly, that aggravation that is there. All right, again, Abimelech. Remember, that's a title, king, just like Pharaoh. And he brings a man with him named Phicol. That word literally means mouth of all. That's what his name means. So he's not just a general, as we see here in the scriptures, but we also see then that he is a speaker for the people. A mouthpiece, if you will, or a spokesman even for the king. He represents all. What about Abimelech now? Well, he wants peace with Abraham. He's had some experience now. He sees that this man is favored by Jehovah God, and he wants peace with him. After agreeing then that they want peace and everything is settled, Abraham points out that there's been a problem with some wells. That Abimelech's people have been taking away wells that he himself had digged, that he had digged. And so he adds 7 ewe lambs to this covenant as a witness that really these wells are his. And what do they call the well? Beersheba, which means the well of 7. And what does the word oath mean here? It means they be seventh themselves. So the number 7 is running constantly through all of this. It's very meaningful to those people at that time. And we see in verse 33 the expression everlasting God. This is also the first time that this comes up in Scripture, meaning the powerful God of unknown and unlimited times. Powerful, totally powerful for all time. That's our God. That is Jehovah God. Chapter 22 now. Looking verses 1 through 19. Chapter 22. God is going to ask something special here. He was asking for Abraham's spiritual surrender. This was the giving back to Jehovah the great gift, his son Isaac, that God had granted to him. Now think about this for a minute. It's just almost as if Isaac had been given to Abraham when Abraham was dead. That is, his body was dead physically as far as procreation is concerned. That his body was not capable of inseminating his wife and giving her a child. It's as if he were dead before and then he comes to life and is given the son. And now he's asking to take this son back. This really has to test the man's faith. This really has to do it. And so in verses 1 and 2, God says to him, you go and you sacrifice and you do it on this mountain that I will show you. What does verse 3 say? He rose up early in the morning to do it. Early in the morning to do God's will. I suggest that you get out your concordance and look up the word early and find out how many times through the scriptures we see God's people getting up early in the morning to do his will. The idea being that they got up determined that day to do exactly what God wanted them to do. And they did it. What do you do early in the morning? What do you do the night before planning your next day? Are you making sure that you're getting up early to do the God's work? To do his work that day? To be his man, his woman, doing what he wants? We see here, God is asking for this gift to come back to him of Isaac, this very special child. And Abraham gets up early in the morning in order to do it. You see, he believes that even though he would kill this son of his, he would be given back to him. He could even be raised for him. For you see, just as if Abraham's body was dead before and then now could reproduce, just as he would kill Isaac, now God could give him back to him. What faith this man has in Jehovah God. Wonderful faith. Let's look at Hebrews 11. This confirms what we're talking about. Hebrews 11, verses 17 through 19. Hebrews 11, 17 to 19. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called. Accounting that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. So you see, he received him, as it were, from a dead situation. But he says, God, you can raise him from the dead. I will make that sacrifice. I will make that sacrifice. What a wonderful, wonderful man this is. Well, they have to travel 3 days. That's quite a ways out to have to make a sacrifice. Who's carrying this wood? Isaac is. So you see, Isaac is not a small child. He's carrying the wood for the sacrifice. We estimate that he's probably somewhere between 16 and 20 years old at this time. So he's not just a child 4, 5, or 6 years old that's being taken up there. We're talking about a young man, a man with strength in his body. This young man is being taken up for the sacrifice. He is able to carry the wood. Isaac has a question for Dad. Where's the lamb? Where do I find this lamb? And God said Abraham says God will provide for himself a lamb. And that's exactly what's going to happen. But you see, in faith, he says that. And the angel of the Lord himself, Jehovah, does provide the lamb. Now, this was a proving for their sake, not for God's sake. God didn't have to have this to know what was in their hearts, but this then proved to themselves. It proved to Abraham that he had the faith that God even would raise him from the dead. But it also tells me something else, my friend. It tells me of the faith that has been passed on to the son Isaac. This man could have fought. This man could have run. He could have done anything to keep from being tied up and placed up there on the altar to be a sacrifice. He could have resisted, but he didn't. He offered himself, literally, did he not? He had the faith that his father had. Oh, that says a lot for Isaac to me. We don't have a whole lot of Isaac here within the Scriptures. We don't have a whole lot of it. But this tells me a lot about him right here, that he let his father bind him and put him up there for a sacrifice. Well, again, we have the covenant is repeated. What did we have? Did God provide a lamb? He most certainly did. It was right there in the bush. It was able to be taken out and given to God, and he was worshipped at that time. What a wonderful God we have. Well, we see the listing of Nahor's descendants in chapter 22, verses 20 through 24. And Abraham's brother's son, Bethuel, is Rebekah's father. So you see, the wife is going to come really within the family. Chapter 23, the death and burial of Sarah. Sad times come in every life, don't they? Sad time now here for Abraham. She dies at Hebron at 127 years of age. Well, that means that she got to see this young man Isaac for about 27 years. And got to see him really into the prime of strength and of being a young man. To see him grow and to be strong and to see the faith that he was showing in Jehovah. Well, Abraham is to buy a grave now within one day, as the custom of then was. And we see that custom coming on down through even later. But within one day. And he is a foreigner. He declares that he's a foreigner. He's a stranger in this land. Now, what does this mean? It means that he's not a landowner. That he owns no property. He is foreign. He is strange to this area. And he also says that he is a sojourner. Today we might say squatter. somebody that just kind of comes in and sets down for a while. He has no permanent dwelling place. He lives in a tent. He has no permanent dwelling place. He has no permanent property, no real estate with which to settle at all. Well, how about us? We buy real estate many times. We have things about us, and we become part of the country, but are we really? Is this really where our citizenship is? We are Christians. Our citizenship is in heaven, not here. We are just sojourners. We are foreigners in this land. Oh yes, we may buy property here and there, but we're not to be of this world. In it, yes. Of it, no, not at all. So what is the purchase price? 400 shekels is settled upon. Well, how much would that be? That'd be maybe $100,000. We're talking about a lot of money for this piece of land. And then we have verses 17 through 20, the description of the land and for her burial. Chapter 24, going in now to Isaac's marriages. Or I'm sorry, Isaac's marriage is where we have it outlined in our outline here. Abraham's instructions to his head servant. What are they? First of all, find a wife for Isaac from among my brethren, and do not take Isaac to that land. And the servant swears to obey. This is a good servant. This man is really, really going to do what Abraham tells him to do. He is a good man. But you notice that he doesn't want to take a wife. Abraham doesn't want to take a wife for his son from these people. He needs to go back to where he come from to get somebody over there. Well, we know again providence is working here. God is helping in the total situation. And then in verses 10 through 14 we see the servant swears, and then his prayer at Nahor. His prayer for guidance. And he does get it. Jehovah answers his prayer. And who is it? Yes, we know already. It is Rebekah. And we see very clearly that this servant is a worshiper of Jehovah. We're going to quit at this point and come back next time right here at the beginning of chapter 24. Read, say, 20 through 30 for the next section. See you then.